I didn't invite it. That's the first honest thing to say about this one. I wasn't looking for a reason to feel insufficient. I wasn't sitting quietly in my life and deciding, you know, what would be useful right now? Let me measure everything I am and everything I have against someone else and see how it holds up. No, it just happened. Someone's life entered my field of awareness, in person or on a screen or in the casual mention of what they'd achieved or where they were going or how things seemed to be unfolding for them with an ease that felt almost offensive in its effortlessness. Yeah. And my ego self, without announcement, without asking permission, without any conscious instructions from me, began its audit. You know what I mean. Quietly, automatically, the way a machine runs when the power is on, just click. Their life against mine, their progress against mine, their apparent arrival against my continued journey, their ease against my complexity. And I was gone. Not with a crash, not with the ignition of the traffic or the electricity or of being right, just a slow, almost imperceptible dimming of me. The present moment losing its color slightly, my own life becoming suddenly less vivid in the light of someone else's. My ego self had found one of the oldest and most practiced territories: comparison. Here's what my ego self never tells me while the comparison is running. It isn't comparing like with like. What it's actually doing, and I've had to sit with this honestly because it's not flattering, is measuring the full unedited complexity of my interior experience against the carefully curated exterior of someone else's life. I know everything about mine. The private doubts, the unfinished projects, the gap between who I intend to be and who I actually am on a Tuesday afternoon when nobody is watching, finger in my nose. The dreams that haven't arrived yet, the ones I've quietly set aside, The mornings that were already over before they started. The conversations that kept replaying, the scrolling. The moments the ego self ran the show and I let it. I know all of that, every unpolished corner of it. And my ego self places that, all of that, next to the surface of someone else's life. The version they've chosen to present, the highlight, the achievement, the moment of apparent ease or arrival or flourishing. And then it calls that a comparison. It was never a comparison. It was an ambush. My ego self taking everything most vulnerable and unresolved about my interior life and holding it up against the most composed and finished looking aspects of someone else's exterior. And finding mine wanting. Of course it found mine wanting. It was designed to. But here's what goes even deeper than the unfairness of the comparison. What my ego self was comparing itself to wasn't even real. Because the ease I perceived in someone else's life, the effortlessness, the apparent arrival, the sense that things were simply working for them in ways they weren't working for me, that was a story. My ego's self-projection onto a surface it couldn't actually see behind. I have no idea what complexity lives inside that life. I have no idea what that person knows about their own unfinished corners. what they replay at 3 a.m., what their ego self does when it's behind the wheel, what drift they returned from this morning before the composed exterior was assembled and presented to the world. Everyone is further along than they feel from the inside. Everyone feels less far along than they look from the outside. My ego self knows this. It has been told this. It has even believed it briefly in moments of clarity, and then it stopped being my ego self. And then someone's life entered its field of awareness, and it forgets completely. Because the comparison isn't really about them. It never was. The comparison is my ego self's most efficient method for maintaining a particular story about me. The story of the gap. The distance between where I am and where I should be. The perpetual insufficiency that keeps me slightly destabilized. Slightly hungry. Slightly convinced that what I currently am and currently have and currently offer is not quite enough. And it's not curiosity. Not dramatically, not devastatingly, no. Just enough to keep the door open for whatever the civilization around me is selling as the solution. You are not enough, but you could be. My ego self absorbed that message so early and so completely that it learned to generate it independently, without any external prompt, fully automated, available at any moment someone else's life drifts into my view. The civilization's work done so thoroughly, it no longer needed the civilization to do it. Society. Advertisements. My ego self had become its own most reliable distributor of insanity. Yes, the observer self, my observer self, returns to this one with a specific quality of seeing. No consolation, not the reassuring voice that says, "But your life is good. You have so much. Remember to be grateful." That's just the ego self trying to fix what the ego self created. You know what I mean? Replacing the story of insufficiency with the story of gratitude without ever questioning the mechanism that generated the insufficiency in the first place. Yeah. My observer self does something quieter and more radical than that. It simply withdraws the premise. Oh, my ego self has been running its audit again, measuring things that cannot be measured against each other, finding a gap that was invented rather than discovered. And in that withdrawal of the premise, that simple refusal to accept the comparison as a valid activity, something releases. Not dramatically. The ego self doesn't concede with grace. It rarely does. But its grip loosens slightly. The audit loses its authority. The gap it was so carefully measuring begins to look less like a fact and more like a habit. A very old habit. One that was installed so early I mistook it for reality. My observer self, standing in the present moment, this one, just this one, and looking around at what's actually here. Not what's missing, not what someone else has that I don't, not the distance between where I am and some imagined point of arrival. No, just what's here. The life I'm actually living, with all its unfinished corners and genuine complexity and real beauty that the ego self's audit is specifically designed not to see. Because the audit needs insufficiency to justify itself, and the present moment contains no insufficiency, only what is. which, when my observer self is the one looking, turns out to be extraordinarily enough. There's a moment in the return from this particular drift that I've come to recognize and quietly value. It's the moment I see the other person again. Not the surface my ego self was measuring itself against, not the highlight or the achievement or the apparent ease, but the person, the consciousness navigating its own complexity, the awareness that is, like mine, doing its best with what it has in the time available. And something that feels like genuine warmth arrives. Not performed, not the ego, self-manufacturing magnanimity as a spiritual exercise. No bypassing of reality. Just warmth, recognition, the natural response of one consciousness genuinely seeing another. The warmth is only available from the observer self. My ego self, busy with its audit, never had time for it. So the next time someone's life enters my awareness and my ego self begins its quiet audit, I want to catch the moment just before the comparison completes, just before the gap gets measured and found waiting and wanting, and ask my observer self one question. What am I actually looking at? Not their life, not mine in relation to theirs, but the mechanism itself, the automatic, uninvited, ancient habit of measurement that my ego self runs, not because it's useful, but because it's familiar. Because insufficiency is the water my ego self learned to swim in so early that it sometimes mistakes it for the only water there is. It is a lake surrounded by a shore. I can get out and walk to another body of water, maybe a river that flows. My observer self knows different water. Still, clear, containing no gap between what is and what should be, just what is. And what is, when my observer self is the one looking, is always, always enough. If something in this episode found you somewhere you recognize, you're already awake enough to know it. That recognition, that quiet sense of, yes, I know that place, is your observer self identifying itself, confirming that it was here the entire time, watching, waiting, ready to step forward the moment you gave it your attention. And that's not nothing. That's everything. If you want to go further, if the territory we've been exploring feels like somewhere worth spending more time, the frequency arc is where this work lives. It's a gathering place, built for those ready to raise their frequency and remember their connection to something larger than the ego self's daily drama. It's not a system, it's not a doctrine. It's just a space where authentic frequency does the work that argument and explanation cannot. You'll find it at the frequency arc, and I'll leave the details in the notes for this episode. And just so you know, there are more episodes in this series, each one a different drift, each one the same 3 movements, each one an ordinary moment revealing something extraordinary about the consciousness experiencing it. Come back for the next one, or find another episode that calls to you, or another podcast that calls to you. The present moment will be there when you arrive. It always is.